Welcome. We'll get started. My name is Paul Herbert. I'm the director of the 1st Division Museum, and delighted to have you here at Cantini. Many familiar faces, but I'm obligated to do my introduction. I think we're to the point where I could probably close my eyes, pick one of you at random, and say, "Come up here and introduce it," and you'd be able to do that. But Cantini is the historic home of Colonel Robert R. McCormick, who was longtime editor, owner, and publisher of the Chicago Tribune. Died here on the estate, a multimillionaire, left his considerable wealth to establish the McCormick Charitable Trust, which is now our parent organization, the Robert R. McCormick Foundation in Chicago, which is a major philanthropy. And he left his estate as a public park for the people of Illinois. And for those of you who have driven down from Wisconsin, it's fine. You're welcome. You're here from Indiana. Wonderful. Delighted to have you. You're a momentary resident of the state of Illinois. Second in the Colonel's heart, only to the Chicago Tribune, was the 1st Division of the U.S. Army, in which he served as a citizen soldier in World War I. And he named this estate Cantini after the little village 75 miles north of France where America fought its very first battle, not only in World War I, first battle in World War I, but our first battle for Europe. And we still have troops in Europe. And so very historic place. And he did that to honor the battle in which he served. And he was devoted to veterans and soldiers and service members for the rest of his life. And so his trustees created a museum to the 1st Division. That's why we tell the 1st Division story here, nearly a century old now. And for those of you who haven't heard, 2 weeks ago, the 1st Infantry Division was alerted for deployment to Iraq, and its headquarters is now in Baghdad. And it is the command and control headquarters over the no boots on the ground advisory effort that we're doing with the Baghdad National Security, or the Iraqi National Security Forces in their conflict with ISIS. 1st Division also has a brigade in Kuwait, an armored brigade. I'm sure should there be more difficulties there, they're ready to do whatever they might have to do, and the rest of the division is at Fort Riley, Kansas. But once again, to the sound of the guns. So we have this lecture series. I don't know if lecture is the right word, but we have this discussion, these discussions to elaborate on the history of the 1st Division, the history of the Army, the history of the country in conflicts. And one of the awful facts of life, of warfare, is that it doesn't end when the war ends. And I don't have to say that to many of you here. The tragedy of war carries long after the war is all over. And it affects family members, it affects veterans, it affects descendants, the children of veterans, it affects our whole society and who we are. And so our author tonight is going to talk about one of those long-forgotten impacts when the federal government tried to help the mothers of America who had lost sons in World War I, help them deal with their loss by offering them an opportunity to go to France and visit the graves of their loved ones who were buried there. And that's what a Gold Star mother is, a Gold Star family member. A Gold Star mother is the mother of a soldier killed in action. And so here to talk about that is John W. Graham. And I have, I think, 7 pages here to share with you on John's biography. But he says I should sum it up by telling you that he's done 4 books, served in 4 libraries in 4 states. Okay? He is currently the Adult Services Coordinator at the Kenton County Public Library in Kentucky, right across the Ohio River from Cincinnati, where he has spent a great deal of his career and life. He was the Department Manager of Government and Business at the Public Library of Cincinnati, where he first came across records of the Gold Star trips in the 1930s, became fascinated with it, and has written this very powerful and I think definitive book on that part of American history. There's a wonderful PBS documentary that was made and aired nationwide based on his research and his work before his book came out. I believe he plans to show a clip from that documentary sometime this evening. He has, as you can imagine, for a professional librarian, a wide range of interests and activities that he has been involved with, and he is both a graduate and received his master's degree from the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. So without further ado, John, we are delighted to have you here and look forward to your talk on the Gold Star Mothers.
Thank you, Paul. Good evening, everybody. My name is John Graham. As Paul said, I'm the author of a book called The Gold Star Mother Pilgrimages of the 1930s. And I couldn't be more thankful and grateful to the folks here at Cantini for hosting me this evening. So many people to thank. Paul Herbert, first of all. I don't get the word definitive treatment of my book given in introductions very often. I'm pretty fond of it, though. I might like to get that in the future. Laura Sears, J.D. Kamas, and then also Alicia from the gift shop. My book, which you can see from here from a great distance, will be conveniently for sale and autograph after the talk this evening. Paul did mention, and I will show, a clip from a PBS documentary that I co-produced from the University of Illinois back in 2004. And I will say this is the definitive documentary on the pilgrimages. It's also the only one. But a topic that really should not be forgotten. This topic is so timely and could not be more appropriate to talk about a World War I topic in the 1st Division Museum. And we really owe a debt of gratitude to Colonel McCormick for making that possible with this facility. And as the 100th anniversary of World War I is upon us, a chance for us, for we Americans, to try not really to remember, because we never knew, to have some recollection of World War I. I'm going to go through a PowerPoint presentation, cover some slides, do some dramatic readings from my book, and then we will watch the documentary for a clip from that, and then I'll take questions and answers afterward, if we can do that. So I've always heard this is a great Q&A group. You got to hold your enthusiasm if we can. Pilgrimage of Remembrance, a date with history talk here this evening. Just as a brief overview, we'll give you an overview of the topic. I like to dive right in the middle and then work our way backward. We will do a little bit of World War 101. I won't make it too much of a lecture, but gosh, we can't avoid it. We will look at some famous names along the way and look at what these pilgrimages, these trips actually were like for the mothers to go overseas. And Paul, you summed it up so well. The government tried. Well, the government succeeded. The government succeeded in using public funds and resources to alleviate private grief. First time, only time? I don't know, but I'll say the first time for sure. And then look at the segregated nature of the pilgrimages. And finally, gosh, we got to give a shout out to the Chicago Tribune and its coverage of the pilgrimages, that's for sure. It would be, we wouldn't know what we know about this topic if it weren't for the Trib overseas. We're going to start with this good-looking fellow right here. He is Quentin Roosevelt. Quentin Roosevelt was the youngest son of Teddy Roosevelt. And if this fellow wouldn't have been president, I don't know who would have been. He's a good-looking guy. World War I was a different animal. He was a prominent fellow, of course, took up flying, became a pilot, trained overseas in France, and then discovered none of his commanding officers wanted to order him into battle because they didn't want to be responsible for the president's son getting shot down. Well, Quentin pulled a lot of strings to do what? Quentin pulled strings to get himself sent to the front and into battle. It's a different time back then. Quentin was got sent to the front, and I'll do a little bit of a reading here from the book just to share some stories with you. My book relies a lot, and librarians love different sources. I've got letters. I've got newspaper accounts. I've got diaries. I've got a letter here from Quentin Roosevelt to his folks, what he was seeing overseas when he was a pilot. He saw a fellow pilot get shot down. He said, quote, "Still, there's no better way if one has to die. It solves things so easily, for you've got nothing to worry about, and even the people you leave have the comfort of knowing how you died. It's very fine, really, the way he went, a buddy of his, fighting against enormous odds, and then 30 seconds of horror and it's all over, because they say that's about how long it takes once your plane is shot down. That sounds like a Hemingway quote, doesn't it? That's a Hemingway quote for you. Unfortunately, Quentin Roosevelt did not survive. He was shot down on Bastille Day over German lines, fighting against enormous odds. And the remarkable thing about, the story tonight we have to tell, the part that always interests me is there's so much compelling things that bring you forward. Shot down over German lines, the Germans go over to investigate who have we shot down. They discover his dog tags. This is Teddy Roosevelt's son. What do the Germans do? They stop fighting and hold a funeral for him. This was the war where millions of men died, hundreds of thousands were never found. The enemy paid tribute to him. We have an account from an American POW that witnessed what happened to Quentin. He wrote, "In a hollow square about the grave were assembled approximately 1,000 German soldiers, standing in regular lines. They were dressed in field gray uniforms, wore steel helmets, and carried rifles. Officers stood at attention. Near the grave was a smashed plane, and beside it was a small group of officers. I did not pass close enough to hear what was being said. I was a prisoner of war. At this time, I did not know who was being buried, but the guards informed me later the funeral was elaborate. I was told afterwards they paid Lieutenant Roosevelt such an honor, not only because he was a gallant aviator who died fighting bravely against odds, as he predicted, but also because he was the gallant son of Colonel Roosevelt, whom the Americans esteemed so highly. Americans were on the move. They retook the site in a few days, discovered Teddy Roosevelt had been buried with honors by the Germans, and then he had a second funeral presided over by a Catholic priest, Father Duffy, where Quentin Roosevelt was buried in rural French countryside. Why do I talk about this in a Gold Star Mother talk? Because right after the war ended, there was a lot of debate. America had never fought a war overseas of this magnitude and had never lost more than 100,000 troops overseas. What to do with the bodies? Well, they decided wisely to give the families a choice, bring the bodies back home, or let them remain overseas. Teddy Roosevelt wrote on the front of the New York Times about his son Quentin, "Let the young oak lie where it fell." That's where the fighting men belong, is overseas with their comrades. And that was very evocative and led to many thousands of Americans leaving their sons overseas after the war. So for me, when I start my talks, Quentin gets first shot at this. But Quentin is just part of the story because, like I said, America had never lost this many men overseas or had this many people fighting overseas. The familiar Blue Star flag was a creation of World War I. Lots of folks think World War II, but it was World War I. And of course, this flag does indicate that there's a member of the armed forces in the household who is serving overseas in harm's way. The Gold Star movement, and this flag is a familiar thing. I'm sure many of you have seen this. The Gold Star flag is also a World War I creation, and this indicates and designates there's a family member who's been lost overseas in one of America's wars. It's a symbol that is still in use today, but surprisingly, in actually talking to some Gold Star families, people don't know what it represents. That's a World War I creation, so we have a couple twin themes here of Gold Star families, Gold Star mothers is who we most specifically think about, and then men buried overseas. I guess I got a couple slides on a lecture. I can't avoid too much of it, but I do want to set the stage a bit with World War I. And I want to simply say that when America entered the war in 1917, we were really not that prepared. We had the 18th best military at the time. We were not a superpower. Quentin Roosevelt and other folks were flying borrowed planes from the Allies. But of course, what we had was troops, men. 2 million men plus overseas when the war ended, and up to 300,000 Americans arriving every month. The European stalemate was just that, and fresh American troops were just what it took to tilt the balance toward the Allies' favor each month, with lots of casualties taking place. How appropriate that we're doing this presentation at Cantigny, where the first American victory took place in May of 1918. So think about the timing. Think about the timing. April 1917, we enter the war, and what do we have to offer? Well, not much at the moment. Mobilization gears up, takes a year, Americans are overseas, and by the end of May 1918, we're able to really take the field in a significant fashion with Colonel McCormick's division and make a difference in the war. And that lasted about 6 more months. So you have about 100,000 American casualties, both battle deaths and illness, racked up in about a 6-month period. So you have a lot of carnage taking place in a very short period of time. The armistice, of course, was November 11th, 1918. The ceasefire at the 11th hour, the 11th minute, of course, is what that is about. And I always like to put this slide in perspective, because what Americans just don't remember, maybe never knew, to be honest with you, is the size and scope of our forces overseas. The Meuse-Argonne battle was the largest battle America ever fought anywhere in terms of the number of troops involved. I often do presentations. I ask if anybody knew that. This audience might have some hands that go up. Almost nobody does. You know, isn't that amazing? Isn't that a shame that that generation, I've got one hand over there, there you go. And lots of times I don't get anybody, and I think people are, we should remember. How can we forget that? We cannot forget that. So with 100,000 Americans dead overseas, again from battle, death, or illness, the American government gave the families a choice of bringing the bodies back home or putting them overseas. About 30,000 Americans are buried over in Europe in World War I cemeteries. Our American cemeteries overseas are single conflict, as it's called, World War I dead just by themselves. 6 of these cemeteries in France, 1 in England, and 1 in Belgium. And Paul mentioned France when we started, and really, for all intents and purposes, this really is a story about battle in France and Americans visiting France, where these cemeteries are located. This is a picture of the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery back when it was completed in the early 1930s. The Meuse-Argonne Cemetery has over 14,000 American war dead in it, which makes it 50% larger than Normandy Beach's number of American dead. Again, the reason I keep going with these presentations, we just have to share this and realize that. Even here at Cantigny, we have a replica of the statue at Normandy Beach Cemetery, but Meuse-Argonne cannot be forgotten, the amount of dead that are there. And having visited, this is Saint-Mihiel Cemetery that is located in eastern France. I visited a few of these cemeteries during the course of my research, really uplifting to see, to be honest with you, the reverence that these are held by the French people. My wife and I were at Saint-Mihiel for a Memorial Day ceremony in 2005, and the French people, even then, were so grateful, not only for World War I, but for World War II, and these cemeteries are a touchstone for that. At another cemetery we visited, the guest book was signed by person after person, French people, because Americans don't visit these very often, and the message in the guest book was, "Thank you for our freedom. Thank you for our freedom," written in English and French by visitors to our national cemeteries. So these are things that are just priceless treasures. Well, let's think about this for a minute. So we have 30,000 families who have made the decision to leave their boys, their loved ones, overseas. There's no grave to decorate. There's no grave to tend. There's stories filtering back that the cemeteries are in disrepair. The wrong bodies are in the wrong graves. Maybe my son is going to come back one day through the door and knock on the door. Families always say that. So what happened? Well, families who could afford to go did. European travel at that time was a true luxury for just a handful of people, but a lot of people did go over. Teddy Roosevelt's wife went overseas right after the armistice was declared and went to Quentin's grave to decorate his grave. So families who could afford to do that did. America at that time was a place to pitch in and help your neighbors. So there were lots of fundraising events to send mothers, Gold Star mothers, over to visit the graves of their boys in Europe. The most well-known example is the American Legion. American Legion had a 10th anniversary expeditionary force in 1927, 10th anniversary of our entry into the war, and brought tens of thousands of Americans over to France for parades and raised money and financed trips by hundreds of mothers to visit. So the World War I generation didn't wait and sit back for a handout. Of course, they were busy doing this themselves. But the people who went, when they would go, it really made a difference. There's no doubt about that. I'll get to Joyce Kilmer in a moment here, and Vietnam mothers, we'll come to that a little bit later on, I have to say. But I want to hit one of the many fascinating personalities in this story, and that is Joyce Kilmer. You know, before I started this, I always thought Joyce Kilmer was a woman. I don't know if anybody else made that mistake. Joyce Kilmer was probably America's most famous poet. He wrote the poem Trees. I think that I shall never see a poem lovely as a tree. That was Joyce Kilmer. He had a family. He was a very prominent fellow. His parents were in society. And what did he do? He pulled every string he could to get himself sent to the front. That was the World War I generation. He has got to come across as one of the most likable fellows that I found in my research, and he does bear a little bit more reading here. He became very good friends with the priest in his division, the 27th Division overseas. The priest recalled visiting and chatting with Joyce Kilmer. We talked about books and fighting and anecdotes and good fellows and things to eat and religion. All the good old human interests are common to us, with a flavor of literature and what human-minded people have said in the past gives them breadth and bottom. He was a good guy. He really was. Unfortunately, his number was up. He was killed in battle in July of 1918. Here's what his commanding officers said about Joyce Kilmer's death. Sergeant Kilmer, at his own insistence, went with me. We were lying together in the Coles woods. Machine gun fire was coming down the draw from the village of Surrennes. A bullet hit him full in the head, killing him instantly. Not only did Sergeant Kilmer find a soldierly joy in the conflict, but he actually sought danger. He was a cool-headed soldier. On the day of his death and the day preceding, he performed the very trying duties of adjutant and was full of eagerness at all times to give his full measure of service. Signed, if you know this name, raise your hand, William Donovan. William Donovan. Wild Bill Donovan was his commanding officer, who went on to form the forerunner of the OSS, the CIA in World War II. Famous poet, Wild Bill Donovan, one lives, one dies. That's war, but that's what Joyce Kilmer's story was. Joyce Kilmer's family was very prominent. They had lots of money. His dad was a chemist with Johnson & Johnson. His mom was somewhat of a stage mother, I guess you could say. But they went overseas as soon as possible to visit his grave, again, to make sure he was buried in the right grave, it was properly tended. Here's what his father wrote to the War Department shortly after they visited. In our journey, he and his wife, Joyce's parents, to the cemetery, and upon our arrival at the cemetery, the sadness was greatly softened when we witnessed the condition of the American cemeteries, always kept in perfect order, kept with the most scrupulous care, and in charge of persons who were in love with and sympathy with the work. So these trips helped. Joyce Kilmer's parents felt the sadness greatly lifted. There's no substitute for losing a son. That's not what this is about. But they could see the graves were tended, and their countrymen had not forgotten. In fact, there was a lot of petitions that Joyce Kilmer's grave didn't have enough trees by it. So there's plenty of trees planted in the vicinity of where he is buried. So if your name was Kilmer, if your name was Roosevelt, if your name had been McCormick, your folks could go. Not everybody could make that. And the prominent people, the leading people who had gone overseas and saw what these trips had done, realized that there's no substitute for the parents, or really the mother, the mother going overseas to decorate the boy's grave. This was a time when the federal government obviously was not involved in every aspect of life. It was before the New Deal, but people realized the only way to do this, if we're going to get a shot at it, is to use government funding, government direction. Right after the war, the first bill was introduced in Congress by Congressman LaGuardia, before he became mayor of New York City, to provide trips overseas to the mothers to visit the graves. That was 1919. As you can see, it took 10 years to get this off the ground, and I think it's easy to make fun of Congress, but there are some real weighty issues here. I think the weightiest one before the New Deal era was, is it even constitutional to spend money on private citizens in this manner? It took a while to debate that one, but really the two main issues here were eligibility and who was in charge of the mission. Eligibility is something that's tremendously fascinating, and Congress wrestled with it a lot. Who got to go on a trip? Well, certainly the Gold Star mother could go. Now, properly, we refer to Gold Star fathers and sisters and things like that. So who else gets to go? Dad? The kids? What about the widow? Can she go? Congress said, hold on. It's not to the whole world to go. Mom can go. The widow can go if she hadn't remarried, and that was it. Anybody else could go along if they paid their own way, but that was who was going to be eligible for a government trip. And the second issue was, okay, who's in charge of this? The Red Cross, well, it's a good idea. They didn't want to do it. The Army, or the War Department, I should say, this was a really depleted time in the military in the interwar years, and that had to be decided. But finally, it was put in charge, the Army, the War Department was put in charge of this, and a bill was signed in Congress really 10 years later in 1929, which honestly is not too soon because these cemeteries were being constructed all throughout the 20s. And then there were 3 subsequent bills in Congress, and I have to give Congress a lot of credit here because they saw in some very technical languages things they passed that just didn't work. And they rectified some minor issues and then appropriated what would have been a fortune back then of $5.3 million. A technical issue would be something like, well, what about a stepmom that raised him from a very young age? Okay, she can go. That's what took a long time to go through all this. So maybe the slide should have been first, but here it comes, the Gold Star Mother Pilgrimages. What we're talking about are, as Paul said in the introduction, government-funded, government-organized trips for mothers. We'll primarily call it mothers. There were some widows who went, that ran for 4 years from 1930 through 1933. The first group, or party they were called, sailed in May of 1930. The last group got back in September 1933. 49 groups sailed overall, and the women were called pilgrims. They weren't tourists, they were pilgrims, because that's what they were on a sacred mission to do. There were about 6,600 of them. And the number one question I get is, will this happen after any other war? The answer is no. So that's what we're talking about here. The people who served as tour guides were the Quartermaster Corps from the United States Army. That's the part of the Army that gets all the men and material and blankets and food from point A to point B. Military officers were used as tour guides on these trips. They invited the pilgrims, planned the routes, made all the arrangements, got everything from railroad tickets to steamship lines. They did a marvelous job, They had 3 million passenger miles and not one lost bag. I want them to do my next vacation. 4 of the mothers died during the trip, and the most challenging part for the military in planning this is what's going to happen when these women get overseas? Are they going to be hysterical? Are they going to have a protest? Will it be too much for them? And the answer, of course, is that they were much more able to hold up and bear up each other and that really wasn't the issue. But the average age of these women was approaching 70 years old. Going overseas for weeks at a time was really challenging. So 4 people dying, if you can say it this way, was actually a good showing. A good showing. And the pilgrimages came in under budget because they had planned for a lot more medical expense, and to be very honest with you, funeral expense as part of the budget process. So they did a terrific job with this. They did do lots of sightseeing and other kinds of recreational things to break up the stress and strain of the trips. But the Army did a marvelous job with this. And what I have here, I don't know how easy this is to tell, but this one slide stands in for many. This is the example of the voluminous correspondence that the Army did back and forth with the mothers just to identify them and see if they wanted to go on a trip. So the first thing you got was a postcard that says, "I accept or decline," an invitation extended to make a pilgrimage to Europe at the expense of the government under provision of the Act of Congress. This was sent to a woman in Ohio, and she accepted. And the correspondence that went out like this was voluminous. I was introduced, I will mention, to a lady who has a Gold Star mother in her family before the talk began this evening. And she has the postcard that was sent out after this, which basically is, "Congratulations, fill in the name. Your invitation has been accepted to attend a pilgrimage at government expense." That particular lady ended up not going, probably because of health reasons. But the correspondence and the work that took place was really monumental. And this was a peacetime army that did not have a lot of resources. So for a military to show flexibility and doing a different kind of mission, I think those folks in the Army deserve a lot of credit for this. A typical pilgrimage trip, what did they do? How long did this take? What happened? Well, they started by getting the women all expenses paid trip from their home, which was generally a train, could have been a bus, to New York City. They spent 1 or 2 nights in a Manhattan hotel while the rest of the women joined the party, joined the group. They sailed on a steamship, first class United States Lines from Hoboken Harbor, sailed overseas to Cherbourg, France, in Paris, except for the handful that went over to England to visit. They grouped the women based on the cemetery they were to visit. Then they would bus the women by cemetery to the countryside around the gravesite. They spent 3 to 5 days at the graveyard. It wasn't just 1 day, it wasn't 2 or 3 days, it was 3 to 4 or 5 visits, so they had a real chance to see the cemetery, to commune with the other mothers, and be healed in the process. Return trip to Paris. By this time, and this is well documented for any kind of war graves tours, the people's minds are so at ease and they're so happy that it would surprise people to see how joyful they were. But they were, because they realized, my boy is with his mates and he's taken care of. Return trip to Paris, sail back home and back to their home, which took about 5 weeks or so. So think about this. This is a time in the United States when very few people went overseas, and a lot of people had never been out of their home counties. And here we are taking a 5-week trip, all expense paid trip to Europe. A handful of pictures which you may or may not be able to see too well. This is the voyage to France. It looks like they're in steerage, but they're actually on the deck enjoying the sunshine. There's a couple seasick ones in there, though, I have to say. Saluting the French tomb of the unknown soldier at the Arc de Triomphe. You know, I think one of the reasons we don't recall World War I is some of the things it gave us. One of the things World War I gave us is the whole notion of a tomb of the unknown soldier, because there were so many hundreds of thousands of bodies never found or identified in all countries. All belligerent countries did the same kind of thing, Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, just like we did. So the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier stop in Paris was mandatory for all the different parties that went overseas. How many stories could we talk about casualties? The one I cite in my book is there was a Marine Corps battle, Marine Corps taking part in a battle in World War I. The Marine Corps lost. This is hard to believe. The Marine Corps lost more men on one day in this battle in the First World War than they had had during their entire history up till then. That's what World War I's legacy is. That's it. Isn't it? It's hard to believe. But that's where the unknown soldier portion of this comes in. The Army officers served as tour guides for the trip. This is Colonel Ellis on your right-hand side, leading a party of women. You can kind of see, I'm going to try my fancy pointer Adam said would work. Look at that. They've got little ribbons on them to indicate that they're with the Gold Star Mother party. I've done talks and occasionally talked to families that say, I've seen one of those. What does that mean? That means the mom was on this trip. Mothers at the cemetery. Here's a picture of mothers arriving in buses at the cemetery. These photos come from the National Archives. The part about this book that was the most difficult to research is the fact that we just don't really know what it was like for these women to visit their sons' graves. This was not the Oprah generation. It was not the Jerry Springer generation. There were some letters and diaries that were kept, but there weren't that many. You know, the healing took place internally and among themselves, but there were a handful of letters and a handful of diaries I did run across of what it was like for the women to be at the gravesite. And a theme I'll cover a couple times tonight is there's real Illinois connections to the Gold Star Mother story and to my book. So I specifically cover a Mary Mann. Mary Mann went overseas to visit the grave of her son Willard in 1931. Willard was born in Chicago and died in August of 1918. She had a very detailed account that was published in a book called Gold Star Mothers of Illinois, which was a solicitation of letters from Gold Star mothers in Illinois on the verge of World War II. These were World War I mothers making pleas for peace on the verge of World War II. And Mary Mann was one of the few that actually had some account of what it was like to be there. And even having said that, it does read like part of a travelogue. The scenery in and around the Somme Cemetery is all that could be desired, she wrote. Margins of shrubbery, trees, and flowers, beds of graveled driveways, flowers everywhere blooming in season, beds of pansies, forget-me-nots, daisies, and baby breath bordered all foliage, being among the decorations seen. And to the extent women shared any accounts of what it was like, well, it reads like a description of the gardens here. That's what they could bring to share. When the party was there to visit, on the first day she was there, we marched silently and reverently to the final resting place of our beloved sons. The day was one of the most beautiful and impressive of my life. Bright sunshine, deep blue sky, and a few snow-white fleecy clouds moved gracefully above as if to shelter us underneath our feet a velvety carpet of green. And then she concluded, the first day at the cemetery, each mother was provided with a beautiful wreath of flowers composed of roses, carnations, daisies, and ferns, a gift from our government. This was the most beautiful and consoling feature, and one appreciated by each mother, who carried the wreath and placed it upon the grave of her hero, as no one but a mother could do. That's what this was about, is the mothers decorating the graves of their heroes. It was not a parade. It was not flashballs popping. There were not paparazzi there. The military left the women to commune in peace once they got to the cemeteries. That's Colonel Ellis there and one of the Army nurses decorating one of the graves in Brookwood Cemetery in London. Percy Stevens, we'll see a couple clips of him in the documentary we're going to see here in a minute. Segregated pilgrimages. The pilgrimages were segregated by race. This became a very controversial issue, although maybe in some ways with America's history of race, maybe people shouldn't be surprised, I suppose. The War Department made this decision in 1930, supported by the Hoover administration. By segregation, I mean African American pilgrims. There were Native Americans and others who traveled with the white parties. Many women declined to go because they would be supporting, in a sense, segregation. But a lot of women went because they fully realized there was no way on earth I would ever get overseas to visit my son's grave had I not taken advantage of this. Two parties went in 1930, two in 31, and then one each the past 2 years. And they received equal treatment in Europe, staying at the same hotels, eating at the same places, which for any of these women was completely foreign, completely unaccustomed to being able to move in that variety. And as one could expect, whenever the media asked, "What do you think of your trip?" It's like, well, I'd like to stay. Although they were quoted in slave dialect, I'd like to, some sort of derogatory language was used. Colonel Benjamin Davis, who was the highest-ranking black military officer at the time, served as tour guide. He became America's first black general. When the black women were overseas, more so than the white pilgrims, they were received and entertained by Jazz Age Paris. Noble Sissel is a name that most people don't remember. He was a big band leader at the day, a playwright, very popular fellow. He welcomed the pilgrims with his band right there. And you can see Colonel Ellis, who's in almost every photo, on the right-hand side, taking a look at this. This slide is significant. I want to pause here because I often get asked or ponder, well, why this is such a compelling story. Why don't people remember it? And I think partly it's because World War II blocks everything else out. I think that's the short answer. But another answer is by 1933, it was the Depression, it was the rise of Germany, and a lot of the mainstream culture was just not interested in celebrating the women from before. So I think the best way to tell this would be from a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald. You can't really beat him for a quote, I would imagine. I have a passage here from his 1933 novel, Tender is the Night. Tender is the Night features the main character, Dick Diver, who's an American who is overseas in Paris. Here's how this passage reads. It's very illustrative, and I think it contrasts with this kind of welcome. He says in the book, there was a party at the next table. They're having lunch at a restaurant, he and two women, that they could not account for. It consisted of an expansive, somewhat secretarial, "Would you mind repeating that, young man?" and a score of women. The party was neither young nor old, nor of any particular social class, yet the party gave an impression of a unit held more closely together than a group of wives stalling through a professional congress of their husbands. Certainly it was more of a unit than any conceivable tourist party. That sentence sums up the pilgrimage notion. This is not a tourist party. An instinct made him suck back the grave derision that formed on his tongue, and he asked the waiter who they were. The waiter said in broken English, "Those are the Gold Star Muzzes, the Gold Star Mothers." Aloud and in low voices, they exclaimed. Rosemary, one of the women at the party, her eyes filled with tears. Probably the young ones are the wives. Over his wine, Dick looked at them again. In their happy faces, in the dignity that surrounded and pervaded the party, he perceived all the maturity of an older America. For a while, the sobered women, it's hard even to read this, made the room more beautiful. Let me read that again, I missed that. For a while, the sobered women who had come to mourn their dead for something they could not replace made the room more beautiful. Almost with an effort, he turned back to the two women at the table and faced the whole new world in which he believed. And he asked the waiter, "Would you mind closing the curtain?" And I think that's sums it up really well of how people were just moving on and trying something different. And the unfortunate part is, look at the respect he has for these women. Look at what shows through, the cohesiveness, the beauty. And then people are moving on, even as he's observing them. Before I get to the next slide, a lot of times when I do this talk, I end right there. But I won't end there because we have a debt of gratitude to pay to the Chicago Tribune, specifically the Chicago Tribune's Paris edition. And the reason I bring this up is Colonel McCormick had the foresight to start a Chicago Tribune overseas edition during the war as a way for GIs to keep in touch with each other and news from home. It lasted until 1934 when it was sold to the New York Herald. It was based in Paris with the Tribune's own foreign news service and their in-house Atlantic and Pacific photo agency. In other words, the Tribune was a worldwide news-gathering organization, and having a paper in Paris was part of this. This newspaper included, how about this for a cast of characters? James Thurber, Henry Miller, Elliot Paul, who's a famous mystery writer, Helen Aiken, Edmund Taylor, William Shirer, Berlin Diary, Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, Floyd Gibbon, and Waverly Root. If you ever want to read a terrific book, look up a book called The Paris Edition. The Paris Edition by Waverly Root tells the story of these guys putting out the newspaper in the 1920s Paris. But why they were there and what they were doing is they put out a marvelous paper that was different from other news coverage Americans got overseas, because the only Americans overseas really were the society crowd. And all they wanted to know is who was going to Biarritz, who was wearing what gown, who was having lunch anywhere. The Tribune reported that too, but what they did do is they gave unprecedented and unbiased coverage to the Gold Star mothers and their stories. You know, the stories we have, the stories I share in here, the things of that sort just wouldn't be the same if it wasn't for the Tribune and the coverage they gave to this. And they really covered in great detail the African American women in a very human way more than anybody else did. And also Party A, the very first party that went over. When the first group went over in 1930, May of 1930, this was front page news. It was front page news for the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times. By 1933, it was not front page news anymore. In fact, in the book, I show a copy of a page from the New York Times. Can I mention the New York Times here? Is it okay? Not the Trib. Final Gold Star Mother party back in the United States, 1 column inch. What's right next to it? Hitler publishes Mein Kampf. How's that for a change in the world? Summed up on one day's news. But the kind of thing that the Tribune did that nobody else really offered is uncovering stories that just were not seen anywhere else. So an example is the very first trip, about 20 women showed up at Saint Mihiel Cemetery to visit. And who was there to greet, well, I shouldn't say to greet them, who was there by sheer coincidence? None other than German General Otto von Gessler and his staff. He was the German war minister from 1920 to 23. He was in France with permission of the government to survey military cemeteries. He and his entourage realized, they read the placard on the bus, realized who these women were. The mothers got off the bus quite unaware of who the visitors were. The attendant press delighted in exchanges. So the Paris edition observed, this is one of many examples of what they wrote, standing at full attention according to the rigid Prussian drill regulations, the visitors with their cropped hair and heavy Teutonic faces seemed curiously awkward and unnatural, especially with the pudgy little French officers fluttering nervously at their flanks. So this was really an unprecedented gathering, just complete serendipity. And the Paris edition was there to report on it. And they also interviewed one of von Gessler's staff members, a Colonel Kell. He was quoted as saying, our machine guns. He's telling this to the mothers and the American press. Our machine guns mowed down those young American troops by the hundreds. But they kept on coming. Hardened by 4 years of war, we were sickened with pity because of the horrible butchery. But we began to know fear because we realized no amount of butchery would stop the advancing wave of the American troops. That's the Trib's Paris edition reporting on this scene for us. That's something I use quite a bit in my book. It's a terrific source. I understand that the Tribune archives are here in the building, as well as Paris edition on microfilm. So anybody who's interested in that era of history, really have to put a plug in for that. So this book came out a few years ago, and I always thought one day I'm going to be here and thank Colonel McCormick for that, because the Paris edition really was one of my best single sources of information. There's no question about it. What I would like to do now is, before I take some questions, because I'm sure there might be a number of them, is I'd like to shift gears and show a documentary, because I can drone on forever, and believe me, I can, but the video's worth the thousands of words. This was, what did I do? I don't know if I can get, well, that's okay like that. Don't show it yet, Adam. Oh, Adam's doing something in the back. This documentary was produced in 2003, thank you, at WILL-TV at the University of Illinois by Allison Davis Wood, who's a well-known documentary producer who now works for the Big Ten Network. It aired nationally on PBS in 2004 and occasionally still airs. It's called Gold Star Mother's Pilgramage of Remembrance, and it's available for purchase. It's available for purchase from Amazon. You can go on Amazon and buy it, or the WILL website at Urbana-Champaign. What I would like to do now is, I'll just tee this up, then we can run it. It's maybe 20 minutes or so. Is our time okay for that? If it goes too long, we can put a stop to it here. It's going to be the final maybe 20% of the documentary, and puts a lot of things in perspective. My final slide, if I can, is we are going to meet in some detail Private Fred Ziegler. Private Ziegler is from Illinois. He grew up in Durand, Illinois, up north of Rockport, near the, someone knows where Durand is back there, near the Wisconsin border. He was killed by artillery fire in just a month before the war ended, buried in the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery. In 1932, his mother and sister visited his grave. Mom went for free, sister paid her own way. That was permissible. My goal for this research was finding people who went on the pilgrimages as kids, like Grace, and interview them. Never found one alive. Well, I found one on the phone, but she had dementia. Never found one alive, but Grace Ziegler was in the phone book in Durand, wrote her a letter. She had just passed away. Her nephews were super nice guys, said, well, she had this scrapbook she kept. Would you like to see it? Yes, I would, because she saved everything from the table decorations on the ship to a diary for the hometown newspaper to the playbill when they went to see a play on Broadway that she didn't like with Wallace Beery and all kinds of people in it. So Private Ziegler, my overall objectives for this is Fred Ziegler somewhere today is very happy his name is recalled. Don't you think? That's how it should be. Adam, can you run the slide here, the video for a bit? We'll just do a few minutes of this. Thank you. Can someone dim the lights? Can I do that?
On the 4th of July, 1932, Louise Ziegler and her daughter Grace got on the train in Durand, Illinois, and began their journey on the Gold Star Pilgrimage.
Coming from a small village and getting on the train and getting off at a place like New York must have been quite eye-opening.
And I think Grace decided that she had to go for her mother's sake. She'd get the money together somehow or another, because I'm pretty sure that my grandmother would not have gone otherwise. Maybe she thought that coming from such a small town and everything, that she would not be able to fit in with this group and to intermingle.
You think about it, if you're 50 or 60 years old and you're asked to go, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 miles away with a complete group of strangers. Could have been a very terrifying experience, but the Army made a real effort to help the women.
From 1930 to 1933, over 6,000 mothers made the journey to the overseas cemeteries. The Army's Quartermaster Corps organized the pilgrimages. The resources that had waged a war were used to bring peace to a group of elderly women.
Colonel Ellis, who organized the parties, wrote a very detailed report, and he said that this had never been done before, and the quartermaster had to serve as a hotel service, steamship service, travel service, medical service. The planning is amazing.
Government didn't try to be cheap about this. The minute they stepped on the train in their hometown, everything was taken care of, even their tips.
Mama got her taste of real service. The porter hung her coat on a hanger and put a cushion under her feet. I told her she would have to get used to service, but I didn't realize how much truth I spoke. Grace Ziegler.
The first time Louise Ziegler traveled across the ocean was when she sailed to America from Germany as a little girl.
The majority of Gold Star mothers were not the activist types. They were your average elderly mother who had probably raised a large family, probably second generation, or possibly first generation immigrant. A lot of the pilgrims couldn't speak English. I think they were just very, very grateful.
Like Louise Ziegler, Percy's mother, Laura Stevens, had immigrated to America. She had sailed from Norway at the age of 7. Now, at the age of 70, she boarded the train in Bend, Oregon, to begin her journey back across the ocean.
So here are middle class and poor people who are leaving their home community, going to New York, the big, big city, spending 2 or 3 days in New York being wined and dined, traveling across an ocean for a week, going to see Paris. It was like the end of the world for any of them.
Since the average age of the mothers was between 61 and 65, the Army was concerned the stress of traveling would be too much. The Army tried to keep the women at ease, but they weren't always successful.
One woman who smoked a pipe, this disturbed her bunkmates. Another woman who washed her clothes in the sink, this also disturbs them. Some snored, they couldn't get along with this. Some women didn't get along with each other. The fact that there was so little of this, rather than so much of it, I think is really astounding.
Colonel Ellis even wanted the pilgrims to feel at home while they were visiting the cemeteries.
He realized that the very basic needs, such as toilet facilities, were unavailable. So in typical American efficient fashion, he made sure that within 90 days there were rest facilities for these women. There were fireplace, and they were served tea there. They had overnight accommodation. They had a lounge. All the amenities that they would have at home, plus a country club atmosphere, and they were built within 90 days.
When possible, the pilgrims were served American-style meals, but they also experienced European dining.
At dinner, the forks were so large that in the States we pitched hay with that kind. We had omelets, thickened pea soup, veal and potato salad, chocolate ice cream, waffles, and apricots. It cost me nearly $1. Grace Ziegler.
Grace did mention, too, that being in a group where everybody had a loss, I think helped, too. I think each one kind of helped the others.
The idea of American mothers coming to Europe and meeting the mothers of France, this would in some way demonstrate to the world the futility of war. It was also at least promoted as one of the goals of the trips.
What's striking about the Gold Star mothers is that economically you have women who would have done this, but also women who never in their wildest dreams, farm women from Kansas or factory workers from Massachusetts would go on these all-expense-paid pilgrimages. And that fit into the rhetoric of World War I. Those who served their country, class differences, regional differences, religious differences don't matter in the end, that we all serve as Americans as one.
However, when you start
Adam,
to probe
can we go ahead and
beneath
pause the video?
the superficial
pause the video back
appearance of the receptions, bands upon...
Thank you. Adam's back in the back doing the audiovisual. That's just a taste of the documentary. I wanted to make sure you had a chance to see that. There's more that goes on with this. But I want to make sure and get a chance for some questions and answers, because I think this is the fascinating topic. I know we've got some microphones, I guess, are going to make their way around the room. If anybody has any questions or need more clarification on anything, let me know. And I won't fail to mention, of course, that we will have books for sale signed right after the presentation. Yeah, right here in front. And we have to wait for the microphone to come here. So when we're doing questions, we're going to have the microphone come to this gentleman up front here, and we can do the question right there. So use your microphone to state the question, because we're live streaming and archiving this.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for just an excellent presentation. Thank you. This is just marvelous. Thank you for coming here. I guess I would have two questions.
Okay.
First of all, I'm curious, was there any damage done to these beautiful cemeteries during World War II? You know, the occupation by Germany and so on. And then I'm wondering such a unique and fascinating subject, what interested you in it? How did you become so involved with it?
And we haven't rehearsed this or anything like that. It's a spontaneous question from the audience, I have to say. The first question is an interesting one. To my knowledge, and unless somebody wants to correct me on this, there was no defacing or destruction of these cemeteries by the occupation forces during World War II. If there's correct, that's correct. So that's what we want to hear. Someone's waving their hand. It may be something to share here. Well, wait, we'll get to that in a second here. To answer your first question, as Paul introduced me, I'm a librarian. I worked in government publications for a number of years. I ran across this topic to me by accident 15 years ago. I ran across a government publication that Congress had put out in 1929 in the library in Cincinnati that was a list. The title was Women Entitled to Make a Pilgrimage Overseas to Visit Their Sons' Graves from the Great War. This book listed the woman's name, her home address, the name of her son, what cemetery he was buried in, what unit he fought in, and did she want to go on a pilgrimage or not. Wow. Never heard of that before. And every part of this just grabbed a hold of me, and I couldn't let go because I knew there was just the most fascinating story and a book that was in there, to be very honest with you. And there had been a book written before. There's Percy Stevens, and his great-grandson wrote a book about the pilgrimages in a way. But that's what got me started on this. It was such a fascinating topic that, and the more I got into it, anywhere you turn, Noble Sissel, Joyce Kilmer, you name it, Paris edition, wow, there's always something to lead you on with it. That's what got me started. Gentleman back there with a baseball hat.
Let me disabuse you of the idea that there's no damage at the cemeteries. I was in 1998 and again in 2003, I was at the Ace Marne Cemetery. Mm-hmm. And at the chapel, there's a shell hole in one of the columns, or apparently a passing German unit launched a shell against this chapel, and the hole is still there. The French did not repair it. Also, the Henry Miller you mentioned, was this the Henry Miller of Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn?
That is the Henry Miller, yes.
Wow.
And, to be honest with you, like Henry Miller, and I'm basing this on Waverly Root's book called The Paris Edition, he was not there all that long. He maybe was just doing copy editing for a while. So it's not like you have James Thurber and Henry Miller and William Shirer in the break room every day for 15 years. But that's the kind of folks they had at the paper. Yep. But thank you for that. I was not aware of that damage. Anybody else? There's a gentleman in the back there. And then the gentleman up front next. Oh, did I miss somebody over there? Yes, in the back, sir.
You mentioned the few Americans who visit the cemeteries there. When I was in France in '95 with my late wife, we were at the Boney Cemetery, which, by the way, is where all the dead from Cantini were taken to after the battle. And we were greeted. It was a beautiful sunny day, and the gardeners were doing everything. And the gentleman, we came in, and he says, "Oh," he says, "you're Americans." He says, "We've had so many Americans here today. You're the third and the fourth."
And probably 30 or 40 French and German and all the rest, yes. There was a gentleman up front here had a question. Oh, the lady in back, I'm sorry, yes.
You had a bullet on one of your later cards about Vietnam. I was just curious what that was referring to.
Yes, and that's interesting. I had mentioned that there were no officially organized government trips after any other war. And partly that's because the United States has a different policy on military dead now. The bodies are brought home. We're not doing American cemeteries in Afghanistan, for example, or Vietnam. A private Vietnam veterans group for a few years raised funds and took Vietnam Gold Star mothers over to Vietnam, not to visit their graves, but to walk where their sons walked and breathe the same air they breathed. And it had the same effect as a pilgrimage. I don't know if we have time or there's interest. That's actually the final few minutes of the documentary here. And when I was the co-producer of the documentary, when Allison was putting this together, I really thought, why are we interviewing these Gold Star mothers from Vietnam? This is a World War I documentary. And then you would see them visit where their sons fought and died. And the response, the pilgrimage effect, was just the same. I know where he fought. I know he's dead. I know he's not going to come home. And I'm at peace now, even though they're not buried there. So I'm completely unaware if there's any group, I doubt very much Afghanistan or Iraq mothers doing this, but there was a handful of women from Vietnam era taken overseas by a Vietnam veterans group. Yes. Gentleman in front there.
You mentioned it took about 10 years to get the legislation passed to let the Gold Star Mothers go overseas. Back in the 20s, there was the Veterans March, the Veterans Camp, and the riots in Washington, D.C. And I just wondered if that had any influence on the legislation.
Well, what you're talking about is covered in the documentary. That's called the Bonus Army, which is, again, the most fascinating part of history. The Bonus Army was a group of veterans that was actually during the early 30s, early part of the Depression, that marched on Washington to lobby for what was called a bonus. They were promised a bonus that coincidentally was going to get paid, I think, 25 years after the war ended in 1945. It's the Depression. People are hungry. There was tens of thousands of veterans camping out in Washington, D.C., called the Bonus Army to get Congress to pay their bonus. Eventually, the government got fed up with them and ordered troops, including George Marshall and George Patton, to run the veterans out of Washington, D.C. This took place the exact day that Grace and Louise Ziegler were on their pilgrimage overseas. The exact day. And the documentary brings us out is the Zieglers were unaware of this and should have been. But it really shows the nature of, you have one part of the government, one of the speakers mentions this in such a way, you have one part of the government treating the mothers of the World War I dead to what really is a luxury trip, while at the same time another part of the same military organization is given the bum's rush to the guys who fought with their sons. I don't have an answer for that except to bring up the dichotomy, and that's what it was. And, I think the circumstances were such that the federal government, again, to show how things were different, the federal government during the 1920s ran a surplus for many years. Times were good, and they can consider doing pilgrimages. During the Depression, it's like it was a different animal. There was just not the money to deal with it. That's a good observation. Yes, back over there, sir.
And this will be our last question.
Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Well, since it's the last, I'll ask two. You mentioned in your talk about when the women got off at this one cemetery, there were German troops, officers there, 19 whatever it was, and I was wondering why they were there. And the second part of the question is, are there German cemeteries, war cemeteries in France from either World War I or World War II?
Well, in terms of the German part, yes, the German officers are there visiting the Saint-Michel. I guess St. Michael is the American pronunciation of the cemetery. The answer is yes. And if any of you have been to France, has anybody been to the Meuse-Argonne Cemetery? You do realize that almost literally right outside the front gate is a German cemetery. Those of you who have been there know exactly what I'm talking about. It is the spookiest thing I've ever seen. It is so different from ours because, you're on enemy soil. You're not waving your flag. It is dark. It is gloomy. The bodies, I can't call them mass graves, but there's plural graves, I guess is the right word. Huge trees overhead, very dark. I don't know if anybody else remembers that experience, but the answer is yes. And there's many of them. And again, the German one I thought was the spookiest thing I'd ever been to. Yep. Well, okay.
Yeah, okay.
Good. Okay.
Great.
Very good.
Okay. Thank you, John.
Oh. Thank you.
Before I thank John for his tremendous presentation, in which I learned a great deal, I'll make one commercial announcement for the Robert R. McCormick Foundation. Since 1993, we have worked with AMVETS to place a digital wireless carillon at every year at an overseas cemetery. And in June of this year, we placed the last one in Europe at the cemetery south of Rome. And now every American cemetery, no matter how large or small, from both of our world wars in Europe, has a carillon on it that plays however the superintendent needs to play in honor of our war dead. We've placed 23 of them at a very considerable cost. We have 4 more to do. There are 2 in the Philippines, 1 in Mexico City, and 1 in Panama. And for those of you who have been there, if you ever go to Europe, I certainly encourage you to visit these places. They are tremendously moving, beautifully maintained, and will be in perpetuity. And every one of those cemeteries, by the way, is American soil. Every one of them is a gift from the people of France and the people of Belgium, the people of Luxembourg, the people of Italy, to the United States. They belong to the United States. They will be American soil in perpetuity. So this is a wonderful presentation. I learned many things that I did not know. A somber presentation, to be sure, but nevertheless, something I've heard about, but really didn't know much about at all. And I appreciate, John, your presentation very well and all of your attendance and participation. We are cheap despite our wealthy benefactor, and so we only have 2 things for you. But come up here, yes. We have this beautiful environmentally correct water bottle, and we're going to keep giving these out until we're done. And I think speaking of perpetuity, and you'll always be able to find yours because yours is the big red one. There you go. And we have, like so many military organizations, and we are not a military organization, but we have this special coin with our logo on the front, and we give one of these to people who have contributed significantly to the history of the United States and its many conflicts. And every year we're going to change the reverse side. This year is the 70th anniversary of all of the heavy fighting in 1944. And because the 1st Division played such a key role in the Normandy invasion in June of 1944, the reverse side is an image of the 16th Infantry Regiment landing at Omaha Beach. And there's only one way you can take those. It's like this, you see? And now that's yours. Got it. Yeah. So. The other thing is, if I ever see you again and I have my coin, it's a challenge coin. And the challenge is that if I grab my coin and hold it up, you have 30 seconds. In airborne units, it's 4 seconds to produce your coin or you buy the beer. All right. So a couple of announcements. John's already said that he'll be willing to sign books in the back. This is our next couple of programs. This first one, let me explain. That'll be the Wheaton College debate team. And for the last 2 years, we've had a debate here. We've worked with them to advise them on a contemporary and controversial topic in military affairs. Because one of the things we try to do here is excite citizens in what our military is and who our soldiers are and what they do, because it all is so consequential. Last year, they took on the issue of sexual assault in the military, highly controversial issue. This year, they're going to debate drone warfare, the pros and cons of drone warfare, and that's open to the public. We want you to come. We want you to listen to the debate, and then after the 2 teams hold the debate, y'all can help decide who wins or engage in the debate yourself. I think it's a wonderful program, and I tell you what, it'll scare you how smart these kids are. That's why we always play the age trump. Go back to that other one there a second ago, and then on December 3rd is our next date with history. That'll be the last one of the year. It's on the Battle of the Bulge because it's the 70th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. We have two brilliant speakers, one of whom is Dave Ulbrich, and the other one, less brilliant, is myself. So please come for that. And then finally, our next slide, please. When you leave here, I'd greatly appreciate it if you drop by the table where the vets are. There's a red, white, and blue mailbox there. If you feel so inclined, drop a donation in. That will go to the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Veterans in Wheaton, which is a wonderful grassroots 501c3 nonprofit organization trying to help those honorably discharged service members who don't have a place to live. And so I would appreciate that. So thanks for coming to Cantini. This is a wrap. See you next time.